Everyone, thanks for joining us today for this event. It's really nice to be here. Presentation topic is exactly what it looks like, how to get a 99th percentile score on the MCAT. Before I jump in, just a few items I want to go over, just give a little background on myself. So I'm Ken, I'm the director of MCAT for MedSchoolCoach. To give you some background, I completed my undergraduate studies at UC Berkeley. I majored in bioengineering as well as neurobiology. I then worked for a year at UCSF as a junior specialist, and then I went to Harvard where I completed my PhD in neuroscience. For the past 12 years, I have been teaching the MCAT to students, so it's been quite a long time. And for the first 5 years, I was actually with the Princeton Review. So I was a senior MCAT instructor, premier tutor, content developer, and instructor trainer. And for that last role, that meant I used to fly all across the country, training new individuals to become MCAT instructors for the Princeton Review. So I've actually been to the UCLA campus a number of times. So there's a good chance many of your upperclassmen who took the MCAT worked with instructors that I trained. About 7 years ago, I was recruited by MedSchoolCoach to start our own MCAT program. So we've been around for 7 years, and that's sort of just giving you the sense of all of my years of MCAT experience. So hopefully I'll be able to leave you all with some helpful information and tips. So the next question I have is actually for all of you, which this is just for me to get a sense of who I'm speaking to today. So just show of hands, can you raise your hand if you are a freshman? All right, quite a lot of you. Sophomore? Okay, junior? And senior? Okay, quite interesting, right? Very few sophomores, but a lot of the other classes. So the presentation, I'll make sure it's helpful for all of you. Certainly for those of you who are juniors and seniors, the MCAT is probably much closer. But even for those of you who are freshmen who might be waiting 2 to 3 years before you take the MCAT, having this background information is still going to be helpful as you think about how you're going to prepare for the MCAT exam. So that's actually my next question, which is, when are you planning on taking the MCAT exam? So let's start with spring 2025. Is anyone taking the MCAT next spring? Okay, we have a few people. Next summer, summer 2025. Okay, we also have a few people. 2026. And everyone else, I assume, is 2027 and on. All right, so we have a few of you who are going to be taking the MCAT next year. So hopefully you're putting in a lot of time and effort into your prep. The good news is you still have months, right? Even with the earliest test date that's coming up in January, you still have a couple months to prepare, which is good. So some of the tips I give will likely still be relevant. So plan for today is we're talking about how to get a 99th percentile MCAT score. So we're going to start first by defining what exactly is a 99th percentile MCAT score. From there, of course, we're going to talk about how to get a 99th percentile MCAT score. And we'll also, of course, time permitting, try to answer some of your questions. So in terms of a 99th percentile MCAT score, it's pretty straightforward, right? This is just a math definition, right? If you get a 70th percentile MCAT score, that means you have an MCAT score that is higher than 70% of all test takers. That would mean, of course, a 99th percentile MCAT score is an MCAT score that is higher than 99% of all test takers, which also means that you are in the top 1% of all MCAT test takers. You can see here, this is the graph showing the score distribution on the MCAT, right? So most of you, if you're not aware, should know that the MCAT is scored between 472 to 528. Right in the middle, a 500, that is the average score on the MCAT. You can also see, of course, the MCAT follows the normal distribution or the bell curve, which essentially means that most students are going to score around average, and very few students are going to be scoring very low on the MCAT, and similarly, very few students will be getting very high scores on the MCAT. If you actually look at this chart, you can actually see what percent of students get each of these scores, right? So if you are thinking, oh, a 99th percentile score is a 528, it's actually not a 528 because you can see it's probably less than 0.1% of all students who get a 528, right? So that wouldn't be a 99th percentile MCAT score, that's a 99.9th percentile, right? So if we're thinking about a 99th percentile score, you just got to add up the percentages until you get to 1%, and currently on the MCAT, that is any MCAT score between 522 to 528 that counts as a 99th percentile MCAT score. And this is a high score, right? And if you take a look at some point at the MSAR, the medical school admissions requirements, a document that AMC creates that gives you information about medical schools and their median MCAT scores, it's actually quite impressive. There's some medical schools where their median MCAT score is within this range, which means half the students they accept are in the top 1% of all MCAT test takers. All right, so now that we know what a 99th percentile MCAT score is, an important question, of course, is do you need a 99th percentile MCAT score? The answer is certainly not, right? And this chart is the same one that Dr. Long was just going over. It's just in a slightly different format. But the takeaway is essentially the same, right? This chart shows applicants of different MCAT and GPA combinations and what percentage of those applicants were accepted to medical school. Right, so you can see, for example, applicants with a GPA between 3.4 and 3.59 and an MCAT score of, let's say, 502 to 505, that 27.9% of those students were accepted to medical school. And of course, as Dr. Long mentioned, the higher your numbers, the better your chances of getting accepted into medical school. You can see, of course, certainly you don't need a 99th percentile MCAT score to get in, but this chart is kind of nice for you to look at. You think about, based on your GPA, what kind of MCAT score might you want to aim for to give yourself a good chance of getting accepted. And there's a couple points that I do want to make about this, right? And these are questions I often get from students, which is, if I have a high GPA, can I get away with a lower MCAT score? Right? And you can really take a look at this by looking at this graph, right? So if you've got an awesome GPA greater than 3.79, remember we said an average MCAT score is a 500. So if you're below average, let's say you're 494, 497, you're looking at 18.5%, right? So that's not fantastic. So usually what I tell students is if you've got a great GPA, keep in mind you spent 3 to 4 years building that GPA by the time you're going to apply to medical school. For many students, they study for the MCAT for 3 to 6 months, right? So if you only spent 3 months studying for the MCAT and you got the score and an awesome GPA, my recommendation is you should really retake the MCAT, right? Otherwise, it's 4 years of work sort of to be let down by 3 months of prep, which if you got that score, chances are you may not have prepped adequately. The other question that I often get is the opposite question, right? Which is a student who had a challenging time with their undergraduate courses. So maybe you started at UCLA, first couple of years were kind of rough, and you're feeling a little demoralized about your GPA. The question, of course, is, can you compensate for that lower GPA with a high MCAT score? And again, we can look at the same, right? So let's say you're a student, your GPA is on the lower end, and we can say you've got a 3.1 GPA, right? 3.1 certainly is considered on the lower end for a pre-med applicant, but if you've got a 3.1 GPA, if you crush the MCAT, you can see you're still looking at pretty good percentages, right? So the point that I usually make to students is you don't necessarily have to say, oh, I messed up in my classes, I have a low GPA, now I can't become a doctor, right? If you crush the MCAT, you certainly still have a good chance of getting accepted into medical school. And I should also mention, this data is specifically for allopathic or MD medical schools, right? So for osteopathic and Caribbean medical schools, there are also additional paths. Right? This is usually just for the students that are really striving for the allopathic or MD medical schools. All right. The last point I want to emphasize, because that's already been mentioned, which is numbers aren't everything, right? But getting a higher MCAT score can certainly help you with your application. All right. So now that we have an understanding of a 99th percentile MCAT score, you're thinking a little bit about the kind of score you want to aim for. Let's now talk about how to get a 99th percentile MCAT score, right? So at this point, I've certainly taught a lot of students, right, on the order of thousands, right, and I've probably logged 20,000 plus hours of teaching experience, either in a classroom format or one-on-one tutoring. And there's a lot of students that I've worked with who got to 99th percentile MCAT scores, but there's also a lot of students who I've worked with who, have gotten 515 plus, 510 plus, 505 plus, 500 plus MCAT scores, right? Every student has a different goal, right, in terms of what they need and want to get into medical school. So you do want to think a little bit about what you need to succeed, right? That being said, I do think it's nice to think about how those students who achieved a 99th percentile MCAT score got there. So you can think a little bit of, can I emulate some of their study techniques, and can that help me perhaps get to my target score? So the first item that I'm going to talk about is making sure that you understand the unique format of the MCAT, right? So if you're a junior or senior at this point, you should be well familiar with the MCAT, and you've probably taken a practice exam. But for those of you who are a freshman, you may not be familiar with the format of the exam, and if you don't know what the exam is about, then certainly it's going to be hard to score well on the exam, right? And there's a lot of details on here, but there's a few key points I want to make, which is number one, you'll notice that the MCAT has 4 sections, right? The Chem, Phys, Cars, Biochem, and Psych Soc sections. These are the abbreviations, by the way, right? Each one has a much longer name. The Chem Phys section is actually the chemical and physical foundations of biological systems, right? So for that reason, we use the abbreviations. But the thing I want to point out is not just the MCAT has 4 sections, but each section is about an hour and a half long, right? So when you add up those 4 sections, the testing time alone is 6 hours and 15 minutes. And if you include the breaks between the sections and the 30-minute lunch break you get in between, you're looking at a 7 to 7.5 hour test day experience, right? That's honestly quite impressive. And most students aren't used to that, right? At most colleges and universities, the longest exam you'll take is a final exam that's probably 3 hours long. This 7-hour exam, that's quite intense, all right? So something for you to think about, because many students, they'll do practice, and often what they'll do is, oh, I'm going to do 20 practice questions on biology, or I'm going to do 3 cars passages. They're just doing a small amount of practice at a time and thinking, oh yeah, I'm studying for the MCAT. And yes, you are studying for the MCAT, but there's some things that you're missing, which is number one, if you only practice in small quantities, you're never going to build up the stamina that you need to maintain focus over a 7-hour exam. And the second thing is, you're also not going to learn how to pace yourself, right? For many students, it's not just a matter of knowing the science content and knowing the test taking strategies. For quite a lot of students, it's time management, as in they can't even finish a section of the exam on time, and they have to leave, a passage unanswered, or they have to guess on the last 5 to 10 questions, right? So the solution, of course, is just make sure that you're doing practice, and you can start with smaller chunks of practice, but eventually you have to build up to full-length practice exams and multiple full-length practice exams so you can learn how to pace yourself and build your mental stamina. The other point I want to make here is about the question types. You might have heard that the MCAT is a multiple choice test, and in some cases that seems great, but also realize the downside of multiple choice tests is it's all or none, right? There's no partial credit on the MCAT, right? But the more important point I want to make here is actually the fact that the multiple choice questions of the exam come in 2 flavors. You've got freestanding questions and passage-based questions. Freestanding questions are exactly what they sound like. They're standalone questions, and they simply ask you, do you know this fact? Do you understand the science concept, right? So those questions aren't too tough. It's the passage-based questions that really makes the MCAT the most difficult of all the pre-health exams, right? And I'm saying you can compare the MCAT, which of course is medical school, with the OAT for optometry school, the DAT for dental school, the PA-CAT for physician assistants, and so forth, right? All of those pre-health exams are easier than the MCAT, and the reason is because they're all freestanding questions, right? So if you learn and memorize a lot of science content, you can get a great score on any of those exams, but it doesn't work so well on the MCAT, and that's because only about 25% of the questions in the MCAT are freestanding questions. The vast majority, the 75% of the questions on the MCAT, are passage-based questions. And the way these passage-based questions work is that you have to read a science passage that's going to introduce new information, new content, new scenarios that you've never learned about before. And in order to answer those questions, you have to apply your knowledge of science to that passage information to answer those questions correctly. So what makes it so different from freestanding questions is it's not a test of memorizing the science content. It's really a test of application. Can you apply the science content to a new situation, right? And that's quite challenging because there's a lot of students who can get high GPAs in college but still struggle in the MCAT because that application aspect of the exam is what they struggle with. All right, so I think that's some of the major points I want to make there. So let's talk about the next point of getting a 99th percentile MCAT score. I was just talking about memorization, right? If anything, I was sort of downplaying memorization, but that's not the case. If you want a 99th percentile MCAT score, you really need to have the information on the content memorized well and also be able to have fast recall, right? So right now, I'm going to throw up a question on here, right? And we're going to do a little test here, right? It's going to be a question, and we can do the same as before. Whoever wants to can just raise your hand, shout out the answer. The first person to get the correct answer, we will give you a free 1-hour session with me, and we can work with you. I can teach you any concept you want for the MCAT, or I can build you a study plan, anything you want for the MCAT. The question is, can you tell me the one-letter code for the basic amino acids? Anyone? And there are some of you studying for the MCAT, right? Yes?
Is it STMQC?
Not quite. Many of those are polar, not basic. Anyone else? Yes?
KRH?
Very good, KRH, all right? So K, lysine, R, arginine, H, histidine, very nice. Gary, if you can please connect her with my email, that'd be great. Yes, congratulations. This was actually pretty good, right? Often when I run through this exercise in presentations, it takes longer, right? And I get a lot more guesses from students of different letters, and sometimes they get certain parts and not others, right? What is the point of me going through this exercise? Well, usually when I'm working with a student and I ask them this exact same question, the response I usually get is, all right, basic amino acids, there's arginine, that's R, there's lysine, that's K, and the last one, oh, histidine, H, right? That's usually the response I get from students, and those students usually say, oh, I have no issues with science content. You know, you can see I gave you the basic amino acids. But why does this matter? Well, normally, a student will take about 25 to 30 seconds to tell me the one-letter code for the 3 basic amino acids. And I wasn't timing earlier, but I guarantee you we were at more than 25 to 30 seconds until we got the correct answer, right? Why does that matter? Well, if you ask a 99th percentile MCAT score the same question, they would tell you within 5 seconds, H or K. Right? And you might be thinking, why does this matter? You know, if I can recall it within 5 seconds versus 25 seconds, I still get the correct answer, right? Well, the difference is that student has 20 more seconds for other questions on the exam, and when you multiply that across the 59 other questions on the exam that they probably also have the content memorized better than you, that's now 20 minutes, right? So for many students that are struggling with that aspect of pacing, where they're running out of time in the exam, often it just comes down to how well do you have that science content memorized, and it is a trend for 99th percentile MCAT scores to have that science content memorized very well. All right, so what's our next point? If this slide wants to move. Oh, all right, we'll come over here. So next aspect of getting a 99th percentile MCAT score is to create an effective study plan. Some aspects of this is pretty straightforward, right? You don't want to just start studying for the MCAT without a plan because then you don't know what you're doing and you also don't know what you should be doing for the MCAT, right? So I honestly want to make this very simple for all of you, which is when it comes to studying for the MCAT, you really only need to do two things, right? You need to review the science content that's tested on the exam, and you need to do practice questions to learn the strategies to score well on the MCAT, right? That's honestly the only two things you need to do. You need to review science content and you need to do practice questions. It sounds so easy, but you'll be surprised how often I speak to students and they essentially drift. And what I mean by drifting is often I'll speak to a student and they're very diligent, they're very hardworking, they pick up a set of MCAT books, they start reading and reviewing it, they're learning the science content, but they have 5 months to study for the MCAT and they're going through the books chapter by chapter, taking extensively detailed notes, and after 4 months, they've got a couple chapters left and they're like, oh, my MCAT's in a month, I better start doing practice, right? And of course, you can probably realize at that point that that student doesn't do adequate practice, and if they don't do enough practice, they don't get the score they want. The other situation I often hear from students is, oh, I don't like reading textbooks, right? Like I don't learn anything from reading. I'd rather just do practice questions. So then you have these students who do a lot of practice questions, right? They'll do 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 MCAT practice questions, but all that happens is they miss a lot of practice questions, right? So there's so many students that fall in one of those two categories where they spend too much time reviewing science content or too much time doing practice, right? So my recommendation really for 95% of all MCAT test takers is go with a 50-50 split, all right? Plan on spending half of your time reviewing science content and half of your time doing practice. That honestly works for 95% of all MCAT test takers, all right? Which of course, you're wondering a little bit about, the 5%, which of course includes the 99th percentile MCAT test takers. There is a slightly different split, but I do want to be a little clear about the difference in that split, right? So let's say you're studying for the MCAT for 6 months. Well, based on that 50-50 split, you should plan on spending about 3 months reviewing science content and 3 months doing practice. If you are a student aiming for a particularly high MCAT score, right, the top 5% of all test takers, then it's more of a 33, 66.7% split, essentially 1/3, 2/3 split. That means 1/3 of your time should be spent doing content review and 2/3 of your time should be doing practice, but I don't mean that you should be doing less content review. It's that you are doing twice as much practice as 95% of all MCAT test takers. So you'll still do 3 months of content review, except you'll do 6 months of practice instead of 3 months of practice. And that's simply because for students who are aiming for particularly high scores, you do need more practice in order to master essentially all of the different tricks and the tests, the different ways that the MCAT will test you on the science content on the exam. All right. So next, use the best MCAT study resources. So I mentioned my background is with the Princeton Review as well as MedSchoolCoach, and I'm sure at some point or another, many of you will attend presentations from other MCAT experts, from other companies. The one thing I would be the most wary of is if the first thing they do is recommend their resources, right? They tell you, oh, you should take our practice exams, you should use our question bank. That's honestly a big red flag because if you want to study for the MCAT, if you want a 99th percentile MCAT score, you need to use the best resources available for the MCAT. And the best resources is the one right here, which is the AAMC online practice materials. The reason why is because it's not the Princeton Review who writes the MCAT, it's not Kaplan, it's not Blueprint, it's not UWorld, it's not Exam Crackers, it's not all of these companies you've heard of. The creators of the MCAT are the AAMC. So the practice questions and practice exams that the AAMC have released are all from previous administrations of the MCAT, and therefore they're going to be the most similar to what you see on test day. So because of that, it's absolutely crucial that as part of your MCAT prep, you complete every single AAMC practice question that has been released, which currently there's about 2,900 AAMC practice questions. Now, I'm not saying you can't use, like different test prep companies and such, right? Again, I taught for Princeton Review for a number of years. But the thing that you need to worry about is if you sign up for an MCAT class and you look at their syllabus and you see that, oh, they're having you do 12 of the practice exams from the company, and you're only taking 3 AAMC practice exams and not using any of the other AAMC study resources, there's clearly a problem with that syllabus, right? Okay, next point is reviewing practice exams. So a conversation I often have with students is students who are studying for the MCAT, but they're struggling, right? They've taken multiple practice exams and their score has plateaued, right? They're like, oh, I got a 507, I got a 504, I got a 506, I got a 504. Their score's not improving. And the question they always ask is, why is my score not improving? I'm studying so hard for the MCAT. I'm doing the practice questions. I'm reviewing the practice questions. I'm using Anki flashcards. I'm using all these things to study for the MCAT. And the answer, honestly, is they're not adequately reviewing their practice exams, right? The MCAT is a standardized exam. And as a standardized exam, it's designed to produce the same MCAT score for a student who takes the MCAT over and over again and has not improved. Right? So if you're getting the same score, it means you're repeatedly making the same mistakes on the exam. And the reason why is because you're not asking yourself these 3 questions when you're reviewing practice exams, which is, why did I get this question wrong? How do I get this question right next time? And what content knowledge was I lacking? Right? The way that most students will review MCAT practice exams is they'll read the question, they'll look at the answer choices, they'll be like, oh, I picked B, but the correct answer is D. And they'll read that paragraph of the solution to the question. They're like, oh, now I understand why D is correct, right? That's not adequate review, right? If you want to improve your score, you need to learn from your mistakes, right? And these are the questions that you ask yourself to really understand where you went wrong with that question, right? What was the issue with your reasoning process? What was the issue with your content? And I know it's easy to say, here are the questions you want to ask, but I think it's better if we actually go through an actual example. So here, we're going to take a look at an MCAT practice question. This is multiple choice, so I'm going to give you all about a minute to take a look at this question, look at the answer choices, see what you think is the correct answer, and then we're going to do a vote. You will all raise your hands for the answer choice you think is correct, and then we'll walk through the question together. All right, let's go ahead and vote. So raise your hand if you think the correct answer is A. Okay, we've got a couple people. Raise your hand if you think the correct answer is B. Okay, a few more. And if you think the correct answer is C, okay, a few. And if you think the correct answer is D, and a good amount, right? And it's pretty even across, each of the answer choices except A, right? So A had the fewest, but it's actually, very nice job to the few students who picked A as the correct answer, right? And of course, the point is not, getting this question correct, because many of you aren't even studying for the MCAT and maybe haven't even taken Physics 2 yet, right? The point I'm trying to make is if you complete an MCAT question like this and you miss this, how exactly should you be doing the review? Like I said, you do need to think about how did you get this question wrong, right? And for some students, they're not really sure of that. So that's where, my role as a tutor, I'll often have a conversation with the student. I'll tell them, hey, take a look at this question and tell me what you're thinking, all right? Because when I ask the student what they're thinking, then I can better understand essentially at what point did they err, right? And to help you better understand how this works, let me show you all of the different steps that you actually need to answer this question correctly, right? And I know it's 9 steps, which is a lot, but I promise you not all MCAT questions are 9 steps. There's actually a lot of questions that is more than 9 steps. But the first step really is you have to be able to identify the subject and topic of the question, right? Take a look at the question, realize, oh, this is a physics question, and specifically it's about optics or mirrors and lenses. Next, you need to be able to rephrase the question in your own words, right? Because if you can't do that, that means you don't really understand what the question is asking you, right? So you have to be able to say, oh, this question is asking me, what is the power of the lens in this electron microscope, right? Then the third question is, it's asking for power, so now this is content. Do you recall the equation for the power of a lens? Power is 1 over focal length. Then the fourth step is you have to recall, hey, they're talking about a diverging lens. Well, diverging lenses and converging lenses, they're the 2 curved lenses you need to know for the MCAT. And you need to recall that while converging lenses have a positive focal length, diverging lenses have a negative focal length. The next aspect is you have to take a look in the answer choices and be like, oh, all of the answer choices, the units is capital D for diopters, and recall, oh, a diopter is actually equivalent to 1 over meters, which is important to keep in mind because on the MCAT, when you're given distances, it's almost always going to be in centimeters. So from there, if you see, oh, this is centimeters, well, do you recall the unit conversion of centimeters to meters, right? 100 centimeters in a meter. The next step is then do that unit conversion, right? Realize 2 centimeters is 0.02 meters, and then the last step is doing the math. Can you do that math of 1 divided by 0.02? And that will give you 50, and the negative focal length gives you A as the correct answer, right? Why is it important to be able to look at a question and be able to break down all the different steps? Well, for many students, it's not going to be the same steps that they missed, right? So for some students, they'll tell me, oh, yeah, I knew the equation for the power of lens was power equals 1 over focal length, right? That wasn't their issue, right? Whereas another student would be like, oh, yeah, this one I forgot, right? Like I forgot diverging lenses have a negative focal length. For other students, it might be, oh, I forgot what a diopter is, right? So they have to review and memorize that unit conversion of, diopters is 1 over meters. But for other students, it's simply the math. Right? You don't have a calculator on the exam. You have to be able to do math like 1 divided by 0.02. And for many students, you're not really doing fractions or dealing with decimal values, right, where you are in college. So sometimes you need to review a little bit of math. So when you look at all the different steps that you need to answer an MCAT question, now you can really answer for yourself at which step did I falter. And based on the step that you erred on, you can then figure out what you have to do so you can get this type of question right next time. All right, another point on content. We talked about memorizing science content is important, but The way you get to that level of memorization is by reviewing the science content over and over again. And I really do mean that, right? All of you at some point will take biochemistry, which is very important for the MCAT. If you don't take biochemistry before the MCAT, you're going to struggle with the MCAT. But in biochemistry, you're certainly going to have to memorize the 20 different amino acids. And many of you can probably spend an afternoon and memorize the 20 amino acids, but the issue is the next day you'll probably forget half of them, right? So you're going to have to review them again the next day, and again a week later, and then 2 weeks later, and then 3 weeks later, right? Any topic for the MCAT, just expect to have to review it many times before you take the exam, right? That's just simply how memorization works. You have to review the science content over and over again, and you can actually see here, this MCAT Basics, I'm not sure if any of you have listened to this podcast, but if any of you like podcasts, if you just open the podcast app or go to Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you'd like, just type in MCAT and you'll find the MCAT Basics podcast is the first podcast that pops up. This is a podcast created by Sam Smith, who was a pre-med student and is now a medical student at George Washington University. When Sam was studying for the MCAT, he realized that the best way for him to learn the science content was to create audio podcasts on the highest yield science content on the exam. And this is completely free, and students love it. I think we get something like 30 to 40,000 downloads a month, which is quite impressive. So this is a nice way to get that repetition of the science content, especially if you have a lot of time on the side. If you are going to the gym, if you're doing chores, if you're commuting, it's a nice way to passively review the science content. All right, my last point is often when I speak to students, they're trying to figure out where they're going wrong with their MCAT prep, right? So I often ask them a lot of questions like, oh, what have you done so far for your prep? How have you reviewed the science content? How are you doing practice? What practice are you doing? How are you reviewing the questions? I'll say very often, it's not a lack of time, right? Pre-med students are usually quite diligent. They put in a lot of time and effort into their MCAT prep. There's students who I speak to that will study 10 to 12 hours a day for the MCAT, right? So for many of these students, it can be really frustrating. They're putting in so much time and effort into their prep, but their score's still not increasing. And the issue really is you don't know what you don't know, right? So if all you do is just try to continue studying 10 to 12 hours a day and not see a result, it's like hitting your head against the wall, which is not very fun, right? So if you are someone who's putting in a lot of time and effort into your studies, if you're seeing improvement, great, keep it up. But if you're someone who's studying for the MCAT and you're not seeing progress, there's a good chance that something is wrong and you may not know what that something is, right? So those are the situations where I highly encourage students to turn to professionals for help, right? And of course, MedSchoolCoach, we have a fantastic team of physician advisors, right, who help students with their applications. We also have a team of MCAT tutors who've all scored between 520 to 528 on the exam, and helping students with the MCAT is what they do, right? So if at any point you're studying for the MCAT, you're having troubles, you can certainly reach out to us for help. Or if you're a student who does not want to have to retake the MCAT, you want to study for the MCAT correctly the first time, there's this QR code here that you can use to book a call. It's a free consultation with a member of our enrollment team, and they can tell you about our different MCAT tutoring packages to see if it is a good fit for you. And that's it for my presentation. I do have my email here, so of course I'll answer questions, but if there are any questions that you think of later or we're not able to answer today, please feel free to shoot me an email. All right, and I think pizza is coming soon, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. That's a good question. So the question is, there are some students who don't take psychology and sociology before they take the MCAT. what are my thoughts on that? My thoughts are it's okay, right? The nice thing about psychology and sociology is many of these concepts you read and they just make sense, right? So when you read things like, oh, individuals with lower social economic status have worse health outcomes, right? It's not like it's so complicated to understand. Sometimes it's kind of like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense, right? I think you see that a lot more often with psychology and sociology, where it's more so if you spend time reviewing the content, it will make sense, as compared to some concepts like organic chemistry and physics, where if you try to learn those concepts on your own, it's much more difficult, right? So to me, before the MCAT, you certainly should take general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, biology, biochemistry. Psychology and sociology are really optional. If you can take them, it's nice, right? Because often they're a nice boost to your GPA, and it's also a nice way to do a little of MCAT prep at the same time, right? If you've taken all those courses and you're trying to think of what additional classes can I take to help me with the MCAT, there's really two things I encourage students to do, which is take more advanced biology classes, right? So physiology is very helpful for the MCAT. That's probably number one. After that, it would be neurobiology and endocrinology, right? And then any other classes, right? Genetics, microbiology, molecular cell biology, all of those are helpful. And the other thing I highly encourage students to do is research, right? You know that research is important, but not as a technician washing test tubes. And I will say, having completed my PhD, it's very convenient for graduate students and postdocs to find those kinds of undergrads, but that's not the kind of undergrad researcher you want to be. When you are in a lab, it is helpful for you to perform actual techniques, not simple stuff like setup and cleanup, right? Do some immunofluorescence, some immunostaining, do some gel electrophoresis, do some Western blots, right? The reason why it is important to have research experience is these are tested on the MCAT. And if you don't have that kind of research experience, then your extent of understanding these lab techniques is often limited to mnemonics like snowdrop, or you learn southern blots for DNA, northern blots for RNA, and western blots for proteins, but you really don't have an understanding of why would anyone do a western blot? Why would anyone do a southern blot, right? So by having that research experience, it can really help you on the exam. Yes?
What is the average time you see a full-time student spending on studying for the MCAT, and the time frame you're talking about, either the 6-month time frame to study or the 9-month time?
That is a great question. So the general question is just how much do students need to study for the MCAT, right? And I can give several examples in different time frames. The first thing I will say is that there's no precise amount, right? Studying for the MCAT isn't like completing a checklist. So if you hit 500 hours of studying, you're guaranteed any score, right? It doesn't work that way, right? I'll tell you that I've spoken to students who've studied for the MCAT for 5 years and still can't break 500, right? I've also worked with students who studied for the MCAT in 3 weeks and got a 520 plus MCAT score, all right? So everything varies, from student to student, right? But that being said, I can still give you some averages so you can get a general sense of what kind of numbers you're looking at, right? So it's often thrown out that the average pre-med student spends 300 hours studying for the MCAT. But the average pre-med student also gets a 500 on the MCAT, which most of you probably don't want. All right, so I would say for most students who want a competitive MCAT score, they're looking at more of around 500 hours of studying, right? Now, if you're looking at 500 hours of studying, how is this often broken down? This is often students who are studying part-time during a semester or studying full-time over the summer, right? So if you're studying full-time over the summer, you can do 40 to 45 hours a week over 12 weeks, right? That's 3 months, that gets you to your 500 hours. Or if you're studying part-time when you're taking classes, usually you do want to take a lighter course load, because if you're trying to take 21 units with all your extracurriculars and still trying to do 20 hours of studying per week, it's not going to work out very well, right? So try to take a lighter course load if you're studying for the MCAT at the same time, and if you can study about 20 to 25 hours per week over 5 to 6 months, that's also how you can reach the 500-ish hours. But keep in mind what I said. these are kind of just ballpark numbers, right? Some of you, if you're truly exceptional, you've got a stellar GPA, your retention of the science content of classes you took years ago is strong, you might not need to study so much, right? But some other students whose retention isn't so good, or maybe you didn't perform as well in some of your classes, right? If your general chemistry grade wasn't very good, or you barely passed organic chemistry, then you probably need even more than that, right? And I'll say, for some of our MCAT tutors, right, who have all scored between 520 to 528 on the exam, we've asked them, and there are multiple tutors on our staff who studied 1,000 hours in order to get their score, right? So it really varies from student to student, but I would say most pre-meds will study full-time over the summer, or part-time in the fall to take it in January, or part-time in the spring to take it in April or May before they take the MCAT. There are some students who study longer than that, and this is just for students who don't like cramming, right? Because keep in mind, if you're studying full-time over the summer, that's pretty much cramming for the MCAT. So for some students who want a more relaxed study schedule, I always encourage them to start earlier, but the earliest you should start your MCAT prep is 1 year in advance of when you're planning on taking the MCAT. I would never start more than a year, because if you're more than a year before the MCAT, you're probably still working your prereqs, and you should honestly just focus on getting good grades. Yes?
When you said we're talking about the split, the 1 to 2 split for practicing and reviewing content, should we be dedicate like a month or in a 3-month schedule, a month for reviewing content and then 2 months of just practice, or should it be spread out and for both?
So my recommendation for students is to have that clean split. Essentially, finish all of your content review before you do practice, right? There's some students who try to mix that in, right? A lot of students have this desire to take a practice exam every weekend from the point when they start studying for the MCAT until they take the exam. And it sounds nice in concept, but the thing is, the first few weeks of your studies, if you take a practice exam, you haven't reviewed probably 80 to 90% of the content, all right? And usually what students will do is they'll just say, oh, I missed this question on optics because I haven't reviewed it yet. But the thing is, if you're going to essentially brush aside that question, it's almost like, what was the point of doing that question in the first place, all right? The other thing that's important is you actually don't know if that's the case. It's also possible that you review optics, but you still miss that question, because it's not just about memorization, it's an issue with strategy, right? So for me, I prefer a clean split between content review and practice, just because it allows you to study more efficiently, right? It's not that you're gonna do less practice, I want you to do a lot of practice, but I want you to have reviewed all of the science content first, so that way there aren't any excuses that can be made of, oh, I haven't reviewed this topic yet. That being said, I also wanna say that when you finish your content review, don't expect to have everything memorized, all right? The point of reviewing all of the science content once is so you've seen everything at least once. When you're doing practice questions, you're still gonna be reviewing science content, but instead of doing a comprehensive review of all of the science content that you do first, it's more targeted review where the concepts you're reviewing are based on the questions that you're missing. Yes? That is an excellent question. So the question is about the CAR section, which is the critical analysis and reasoning skills section. This is the section of the exam that does not test any science content. Instead, you have to read passages on social studies and humanities topics and answer questions about them. And this is quite a challenge for many pre-med students. Often many students have a very strong science foundation. So the Chem Phys, the Biochem, and the Psych-Soc sections don't give them that many issues. It's the CAR section, right? My recommendation for the CAR section really depends on where exactly a student is, right? And I always encourage students to take a practice exam at the beginning of their studies to figure out if they're naturally strong in CARs or weak in CARs, all right? So if you take a practice exam, if you get at least a 127 in CARs, you honestly don't need to do any CARs prep aside from completing all of the AAMC CARs questions, right? That can be enough for you to get a strong CAR score. Now, if you're below a 127, you're definitely going to have to do some CARs prep while you're reviewing the science content. But what you need to do, again, differs from student to student, right? So some students who are around, let's say a 124, 125, I have to look more closely at, what is the reason why you're missing the questions that are preventing you from getting a higher score. For some students, it's a pacing issue, right? Which is I look at the questions and I see, oh, hey, your accuracy is actually pretty good. You've got about 80% accuracy, and it's really on the last two passages where it drops off because you're running out of time, right? For that student, they mostly just need to do more practice to pace themselves, to learn how to read faster, so that way they can have that high accuracy but maintain over all 9 passages on the exam. For other students, I look more closely, and you don't see that kind of trend where they're missing a lot of questions at the end. You see a different trend, which might be that whether they do well in a passage or poor on a passage is based on the passage topic, right? So if the passage topic is on public health, if it's on economics, if it's on architecture, they do just fine. But then when they get to a passage that's talking about the meaning behind this painting or artwork, or a passage on philosophy, they bomb the passage, right? And in those cases, I wouldn't necessarily say it's like a lack of interest, right? Like maybe some students have interest in those passages, but the challenge with those passages is that the language is often more advanced and it's harder to understand. So many students, when they read these passages, they don't leave with an understanding of what the passage was about. For these students, there's actually a different approach. It's not necessarily to force yourself to understand philosophy, right? Because that might just not happen. But it's more so to learn about the question types on the CARS section, right? There's 3 types of CARS questions on the exam. There's CMP, which are foundations of comprehension questions. There's RWT, reasoning within the text questions, and RBT, reasoning beyond the text questions. Each of these different questions test different reasoning skills. So if you don't understand the question types, then your lack of passage comprehension means you're going to miss a lot of questions. But if you understand the question types and the reasoning skills required to answer each, there's many situations where you don't understand the passage very well, but you can still get some of the questions correct, right? And the last group of students that I'll talk about are students that are just awful at CARS, right? So if you do a CARS section, you get a 121 or 122. Honestly, it means you're really bad at CARS, right? For these students who are really weak in CARS, often they're trying to focus on all of these techniques, right? Of which words in the passage I should highlight. How should I take notes while I read? Or, should I try to read the question stems of all the questions in the passage before I read the passage, right? That way I know what part of the passage to read for. That's actually the wrong approach, right? If you're just focusing on test-taking strategies when your CAR score is so low, it's not going to help you, right? So if you're really weak in CARS, the issue is really your comprehension, right? As in you're not reading the passages properly, right? And if you're someone in this situation, something that can really help you is try to find a friend who's really good at CARS. Right? And do this exercise where you both pull up a CARS passage, you both read the CARS passage, and afterwards you summarize your takeaway of the passage, right? Like, I think the central thesis of this passage is so-and-so, and then ask your high-scoring CARS friend to do the same, and chances are it's completely off, right? And that's the issue with low-scoring CARS student. You read a CARS passage, and whatever your takeaway was just completely off from what your takeaway was supposed to be, right? So for these students to improve in CARS, it's incredibly hard because you have to teach yourself how to read properly. And part of the reason why is because many students who struggle in CARS, with their science background, they're used to reading science textbooks, and everything they read in these textbooks, they just take as a fact, right? But that's not how you read in CARS. In CARS, you really have to challenge the text. You have to think about what is the argument that the author is making, and is it a strong argument or is it a weak argument, right? So if you're really weak in CARS, then the first focus should really be on improving your reading comprehension. Yes?
So when you talk about content review, are there any resources that you recommend for that, or is that more of a case of going through your old textbook and reviewing that yourself?
Good question. For content review, Using your textbooks and notes from your college classes usually isn't too effective, and that's just because the curriculum of your college courses doesn't match the MCAT. All right, so what that means is there's a lot of science content you learn in your college courses that isn't tested on the MCAT, and likewise, there's a lot of content tested on the MCAT that you've never learned about in your college courses. All right, so when it comes to content review, that first phase of your studies, I would say the resources most students will use is, number one, a set of MCAT books. All right, so pick up a set of MCAT books. These are essentially textbooks, but focus specifically on the science content that's tested on exam. The second is videos, right? So videos are not meant to replace textbooks. Videos are meant as a supplemental resource, as in when you're reading the books, if there's something that you don't understand, you watch a video to help explain it to you, right? And any of you who are interested, we actually have a lot of videos. So if you go to YouTube, you can look up MedSchoolCoach MCAT Prep, and you will find a lot of videos of me teaching science content, which hopefully will be helpful to you sometime in the future. But videos are meant as a supplement, right? They don't replace textbooks. And the third item that students will often use is some kind of memory aid, right? This is more so to just focus on repetition and memory. And I will say for most students, they'll use Anki flashcards. All right, and I think we're over by a decent amount. So perhaps we'll call it here, and hopefully your pizza will be here soon.